Welcome to Void Case Files. Before we dive into today's investigation, I need to tell you something important. Right now, 93.8% of you watching aren't subscribed. If these deep dives into the unexplained keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers by New Year's. We're posting daily videos, bringing you cases they don't want you to know about. Now, let's talk about Yellowstone, September 26th, 2010. A black Lexus sedan sits abandoned at Craig Pass in Yellowstone National Park. Keys in the ignition, door unlocked. No hiking trails nearby. The driver, 48-year-old Stuart Isaac, has vanished without a trace. August 16th, 2022. A park employee discovers a shoe floating in the abyss pool. Inside the shoe, part of a human foot. The water is 140 degrees. The body has been dissolving for 2 weeks. These aren't isolated incidents. Over 250 people have died in Yellowstone since 1872. But what rangers whisper about in the backcountry, those stories never make it into the official reports. What you're about to hear will change the way you think about America's first national park forever. Stuart Isaac was born in the Republic of Palau, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean. He moved to the United States as a young man, eventually settling in Burtonsville, Maryland, where he built a quiet, unremarkable life. He worked in database management, lived in a modest townhouse, kept to himself mostly. His neighbors described him as polite but reserved, the kind of person you'd exchange pleasantries with at the mailbox but never really know. On September 6th, 2010, Stuart Isaac woke up, made breakfast, and left a handwritten note on the kitchen table for his family. The note was brief. It said he was going on a cross-country trip and would be back in a couple of weeks. Nothing unusual about that. People take road trips all the time, especially in early September when the summer crowds are thinning and the weather is still warm. But Stuart Isaac had no hiking experience. He'd never been camping. He had no outdoor skills whatsoever. His idea of adventure was trying a new restaurant or maybe visiting a museum. And yet, that morning, he got in his black 2009 Lexus sedan with the vanity plate Belek and started driving. 32 hours straight from Maryland to Wyoming. No stops except for gas and quick bathroom breaks. No hotel rooms. No leisurely meals at roadside diners. Just driving, mile after mile, like a man racing to catch a train he absolutely could not miss. On September 24th at 3:30 in the morning, somewhere on the endless stretch of interstate between Maryland and Wyoming, Stuart made a phone call. He called his high school friend, Matsue Evans, who still lived in Guam. Because of the time difference, it was actually early evening for her, around 6:30 p.m. They talked for 2 hours. 2 full hours in the middle of Stuart's desperate drive west. Matsue was shocked when her phone rang, and Stuart's name appeared on the screen. She told investigators later that she and Stuart had been friends since high school, but they rarely spoke anymore. They'd text occasionally, maybe exchange emails around the holidays, but phone calls? Never. They just weren't that kind of friends anymore. Too much time had passed, too much distance, too many years of separate lives. And certainly not at 3:30 in the morning his time when he should have been sleeping in some roadside motel. "I'm heading to Yellowstone," Stuart told her during that call. The conversation wandered, touching on old memories from high school, mutual friends they'd lost touch with, the weather in Guam versus the weather in Maryland. Normal things. But years later, after Stuart vanished, Matsue would tell reporters that something in his voice sounded different that night. Not scared exactly, not excited either, just different. Off. Like he was reading from a script he didn't quite understand, or like he was talking to her from very far away, even though he was just on the other end of a phone line. "Why Yellowstone?" she'd asked him. Stuart had never mentioned any interest in national parks. He wasn't the outdoorsy type. She couldn't remember him ever talking about wanting to see geysers or wildlife or mountain scenery. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Matsue thought maybe the connection had dropped. Then Stuart said, "I have to go there. I've been thinking about it for days. I can't explain it, but I have to go." Matsue laughed, thinking he was joking around like they used to do in high school. But Stuart didn't laugh back. The conversation moved on to other topics, and eventually they said goodbye. Matsue hung up, thinking it had been nice to catch up, if a bit strange. She had no idea it would be the last time anyone would hear from Stuart Isaac. 2 days later, on September 26th, a park ranger named Timothy Walsh was making an evening patrol along the Grand Loop Road. It was Sunday, and the weekend crowds had thinned out. The road was quiet. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the landscape. Walsh had been a ranger in Yellowstone for 11 years at that point. He knew every mile of that road, every turnout, every scenic overlook. Craig Pass sits at 8,262 feet elevation, right on the Continental Divide. It's a beautiful spot, but not particularly dramatic by Yellowstone standards. There's no major geyser basin, no spectacular waterfall, no wildlife viewing area. Just a small parking turnout and a short wooden boardwalk leading to Isa Lake, a tiny pond famous for being one of the few lakes in the world that drains into two different oceans. Water from the west side flows toward the Pacific via the Snake River. Water from the east side flows toward the Atlantic via the Missouri River. It's a neat geographic quirk, the kind of thing that makes people stop for 5 minutes to take a photo and read the interpretive sign before driving on. Walsh's headlights caught something unusual as he approached the Craig Pass turnout, a black Lexus sedan parked at the far end of the lot. That wasn't strange by itself. People stopped there all the time, but something about the car's position caught his attention. It was parked facing away from the road, toward the trees, as if the driver had deliberately positioned it to look into the forest rather than at the lake. Walsh pulled up next to the Lexus and got out. The air was cold at that elevation, even in late September. He could see his breath. The car's windows were clear, not fogged, which suggested it had been sitting there for a while. The engine was cold. Walsh shined his flashlight through the driver's side window and immediately noticed two things. First, the keys were in the ignition. Second, the door was unlocked. He opened the door carefully, half expecting to find someone passed out in the back seat or slumped over with a medical emergency. But the car was empty. Completely empty. No driver, no passenger, no one curled up, sleeping in the back. Walsh checked the registration in the glove box. The car belonged to Stuart Isaac from Burtonsville, Maryland. There was a road atlas on the passenger seat, open to a map of Wyoming with a route marked in pen from the eastern border straight to Yellowstone. Nothing else seemed out of place. The car was clean, well maintained, not the vehicle of someone having a mental health crisis or living out of their car. Walsh radioed it in and started looking around the parking area. Here's what made this immediately strange to any ranger familiar with Craig Pass. There were no hiking trails there. None. It's just a parking area on the road between Old Faithful and West Thumb. The boardwalk to Isa Lake is maybe 50 feet long, a 2-minute stroll to look at the pond, and then back to your car. Nobody goes hiking from Craig Pass because there's nowhere to hike to. The forest surrounding the area is dense lodgepole pine, the kind of terrain that's difficult to walk through without a trail. No views, no destination, no reason to bushwhack into it. But Stuart Isaac had driven 32 hours straight, over 2,000 miles from his home in Maryland, to park his car in this exact spot, and then he had walked away into the wilderness. The search began immediately. By morning, the park had mobilized a full search and rescue operation. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the forests and meadows around Craig Pass. Ground teams with search dogs combed the area in expanding circles, starting from the parking lot and working outward. They searched for 11 days, covering hundreds of square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in America. They looked in every direction. They checked every drainage, every ridge, every possible route Stuart could have taken. They found nothing. No footprints leaving the parking area, even though the ground was soft enough in places that footprints should have been visible. No pieces of clothing snagged on branches. No camping gear. No water bottles dropped on the ground. No disturbed vegetation showing where someone had pushed through the brush. No body. Stuart Isaac had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped out of that Lexus. The case file remains open to this day, sitting in a drawer somewhere in park headquarters, gathering dust alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances. Stuart's family still doesn't have answers. They held a memorial service for him in 2012, 2 years after he vanished, even though there was no body to bury. His mother died in 2019, never knowing what happened to her son. His sister still calls the Park Service every few years, asking if there's been any new information. The answer is always no. But here's what the public doesn't know, what the Park Service doesn't advertise in their missing persons reports, and what doesn't appear in the official incident logs available through Freedom of Information Act requests. Craig Pass sits directly above one of the most active geothermal systems in Yellowstone. Beneath that innocent-looking parking area, beneath the forest floor and the bedrock, there are underground rivers of superheated water flowing through ancient lava tubes. There are caves that have never been mapped, vents that exhale steam and sulfurous gases, a vast network of thermal features that shift and change with the seasons as water finds new paths through the fractured volcanic rock. And Stuart Isaac isn't the first person to vanish from that exact location. Rangers who've worked in Yellowstone for decades will tell you off the record, after they've retired, and the non-disclosure agreements they signed have faded in importance, that abandoned vehicles have been found at Craig Pass before. Not often, maybe once every 10 or 15 years. But it happens. Always the same story. Car found, often with the keys still inside. Person gone. No explanation. No body ever recovered. The Park Service doesn't publicise these cases because they don't want to scare tourists. Yellowstone's economy depends on 4 million visitors a year spending money on hotels and campgrounds and souvenir shops. You can't have people thinking there's something wrong with certain areas of the park. You can't have conspiracy theories spreading on social media about mysterious disappearances. So the cases get investigated quietly, the files get sealed after the search is called off, and life goes on. But the rangers know. They remember. They talk to each other in the break rooms and the ranger stations, swapping stories that never make it into official reports. And they've started to notice something. The disappearances around Craig Pass have been increasing in frequency. What used to happen once every 10 or 15 years started happening every 5 or 6 years in the 1990s. Then, every 3 or 4 years in the 2000s. Stuart Isaac in 2010. Another hiker in 2014. A woman from California whose rental car was found in the same parking lot. A park employee in 2017 who told his roommate he was going for a drive on his day off and never came back. Something about Craig Pass is attracting people, or calling them, or pulling them in. Whatever it is, it's getting stronger. 11 years after Stuart Isaac vanished, something happened at Shoshone Lake that would force even the most skeptical rangers to admit that something is deeply wrong in Yellowstone's backcountry. Something that can't be explained away as accidents or poor judgment or the simple fact that nature is dangerous. Kim Crumbo was not your average 74-year-old retiree. He was a former Navy SEAL who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, seeing combat in some of the most dangerous operations of that war. After he left the military, he spent 20 years working as a river ranger and wilderness coordinator at Grand Canyon National Park. He was a conservation legend, a man who dedicated his life to protecting wild places and had been honoured by 5 different environmental organisations for his work. He'd run countless rivers, hiked thousands of miles of backcountry trails, survived situations that would have killed lesser men. If anyone could handle themselves in the wilderness, it was Kim Crumbo. In September 2021, Kim and his half-brother Mark O'Neill planned a 4-night canoe trip to Shoshone Lake. Mark, who was 67, was also a retired park ranger. He'd spent 20 years working at Olympic National Park in Washington, earning recognition for his wilderness skills and his supportive supervision of younger rangers. The 2 brothers were both experienced paddlers, both comfortable in remote wilderness, both men who understood the risks and knew how to mitigate them. Shoshone Lake is the 2nd largest lake in Yellowstone, covering about 12.5 square miles. It's completely remote. There are no roads leading to it. To get there, you have to paddle across Lewis Lake, then follow the Lewis River Channel for 3 miles, through narrow, winding passages where the current can be tricky. It's the kind of place that draws experienced outdoorsmen who want true wilderness solitude, who want to camp on beaches where you won't see another human being for days, who want to fall asleep to the sound of waves lapping the shore and wake up to elk bugling in the meadows. Kim and Mark were excited about the trip. They'd been planning it for months, coordinating their schedules, gathering gear, studying maps of the lake to decide which campsites to reserve. It would be a chance to reconnect, to spend time together away from the noise and complications of modern life, to sit around a campfire and tell stories the way brothers do when they're alone in the wilderness. On September 12, 2021, they launched their canoe from Lewis Lake and began the paddle north. They checked in with a ranger at the launch point, showing their backcountry permit and going over their itinerary. They were planning to camp on the south shore the first night, then work their way around the lake over the next 3 days, ending up back at the channel on September 16th. Everything was in order. Their gear was appropriate. They had plenty of food and water. They knew what they were doing. On September 19th, 3 days after Kim and Mark should have returned, a family member reported them overdue. That wasn't necessarily cause for immediate alarm. Sometimes backcountry permits run over by a day because the weather delays travel or someone gets a minor injury that slows them down. But the Park Service takes overdue reports seriously, especially on Shoshone Lake, which is known for sudden storms and dangerous wind conditions. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately. They found the brothers' campsite on the south shore of the lake. The tent was still standing, guy lines properly staked, rainfly secured. Gear was organized inside and around the tent. Sleeping bags were rolled up. A food bag was hanging properly from a tree branch, protected from bears. Nothing looked wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that a bear or other animal had disturbed the camp. It looked like the camp of 2 experienced outdoorsmen who were planning to come back. Then, on the east shore of the lake, about 4 miles from the campsite, searchers found a canoe pulled partially onto the beach. A paddle was lying nearby. A personal flotation device, the kind paddlers wear, was floating in the shallow water at the shore. Other belongings were scattered along the beach. A water bottle, a hat, a dry bag that had come open, its contents spilled across the sand. On September 20th, searchers found Mark O'Neill's body on the eastern shore, not far from where the canoe had been found. He was 67 years old. He was wearing his clothes, but not his life jacket. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no wounds, no indication he'd been attacked by an animal. The autopsy would later confirm he died of hypothermia. The water in Shoshone Lake averages 48 degrees year-round. If you fall into water that cold without protective gear, you have maybe 20 to 30 minutes before hypothermia sets in and your muscles stop working and you can't swim anymore and you sink beneath the surface. But Kim Crumbo was nowhere to be found. The search for Kim became one of the most intensive operations in Yellowstone's recent history. The park threw everything they had at it. Ground teams swept every trail in the area, every game path, every possible route Kim could have taken if he'd made it to shore. Boats with sonar equipment gridded the entire lake, methodically mapping every inch of the bottom, looking for anything that might be a body. Helicopters scanned from above, flying low search patterns over the forest and the water, using thermal cameras that could detect body heat through tree cover. Search and rescue dogs work the shorelines, trained to detect the scent of human remains even underwater. Even Cam Sholly, the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, personally joined the search. He's a man who normally deals with budgets and policy and public relations, not ground-level search and rescue operations. But Kim Crumbo had been one of their own, a retired ranger, a man who dedicated his life to the Park Service. Sholly hiked for 6 hours in the rain along the eastern shore, checking every cove and cranny, looking behind every fallen log, searching for any sign of Kim Crumbo. They searched for 3 weeks. As September turned into October, the weather got worse. Snow began falling at night. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The lake started to ice over around the edges, and still they found nothing. Kim Crumbo, one of the most experienced outdoorsmen in America, a Navy SEAL, a man who'd survived Vietnam and 20 years of wilderness work in the Grand Canyon, a man who could navigate by the stars and build a fire in the rain and find water in the desert, had vanished without a trace. His life jacket was found on the shore. That's important. Think about what that means. Kim's life jacket was sitting on the beach, neatly placed on a rock, not on his body where it should have been, not floating in the water where it would have been if he'd drowned while wearing it. Just sitting there on the shore, as if he'd taken it off deliberately and carefully set it down before walking away. On October 8th, as snow began to fall harder and temperatures dropped into the teens at night, the Park Service officially scaled back the recovery effort. In their press release, Superintendent Sholly said, All of us at Yellowstone extend our deepest sympathies to the families, friends and colleagues of both Mark and Kim. I want to personally thank the teams from Yellowstone, other parks and agencies, and partner organisations who work to help us locate Mark and who continue search efforts to bring Kim home. But that press release didn't mention what the search teams had actually found. It didn't mention the things that made even the most experienced rangers uncomfortable. It didn't mention the conversations happening quietly in ranger stations and park vehicles, conversations about things that didn't add up, things that suggested this wasn't just a tragic paddling accident. We'll come back to those details, but first we need to talk about the hot springs, because if you want to understand what's really happening in Yellowstone, you need to understand that the thermal features aren't just dangerous, they're something else entirely. July 31st, 2022. Il Hun Ro, a 70-year-old man from Los Angeles, visited the West Thumb Geyser Basin. It was a Thursday afternoon, warm and sunny, perfect weather for sightseeing. West Thumb sits on the shore of Yellowstone Lake, one of the most scenic spots in the park. The geyser basin there features colourful hot springs and pools right at the water's edge, with boardwalks that let visitors get close enough to see the vivid blues and greens and oranges created by thermophilic bacteria living in the superheated water. Il Hun Ro walked out to the Abyss Pool, one of Yellowstone's deepest hot springs. The pool is 53 feet deep, a vertical shaft dropping straight down into the earth. The water temperature at the surface is around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Deeper down, it's even hotter. The pool got its name because when you look into it, you're looking into an abyss. The water is so deep and so clear that you can see down and down and down, and it feels like you're staring into the planet's core. Nobody saw what happened next. Nobody witnessed Il Hun Ro enter the water. The boardwalk at West Thumb is usually crowded during summer afternoons, but for some reason, at that particular moment, no one was looking at the Abyss Pool. Maybe people were focused on other thermal features. Maybe they were taking selfies with Yellowstone Lake in the background. Maybe they were reading the interpretive signs. Whatever the reason, Il Hun Ro walked to the edge of the boardwalk, stepped over the railing, and went into the pool without anyone noticing. For 16 days, nobody knew anything was wrong. Il Hun Ro's vehicle sat in the parking lot, one car among hundreds. No one reported him missing. Maybe he had no family. Maybe the people who knew him assumed he'd extended his trip. Maybe they thought he'd decided to stay longer or drive somewhere else. The car just sat there, day after day, gathering dust. On August 16th, a park employee was making a routine check of the thermal areas at West Thumb. It was early morning, before the crowds arrived, when the park is quiet and beautiful and belongs to the people who work there. The employee was walking the boardwalk, checking that the railings were secure and the signs hadn't been vandalized, doing the kind of routine maintenance work that keeps the park running. That's when they saw it. A shoe floating on the surface of the Abyss Pool. Not just a shoe with something inside it, something that looked organic, something that had once been part of a human being. The employee immediately called for help. Rangers arrived and, after careful examination and photography, they retrieved the shoe from the pool using a long-handled net. Inside the shoe was part of a human foot. Bones, mostly. Some tissue, not much else. The heat and the minerals and the bacteria in the pool had done their work over 2 weeks, dissolving flesh and cartilage, breaking down everything soft, leaving behind only the hardest structures. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Il Hun Ro. His body had been in that 140-degree water for over 2 weeks, slowly dissolving in the heat and the acidic minerals. The park tried to use underwater cameras to see if there were more remains at the bottom of the pool, but the depth and the conditions made it impossible. Whatever was left of Il Hun Ro was down there in the abyss, 53 feet below the surface, in water hot enough to cook meat. When investigators searched Il Hun Ro's abandoned vehicle in the parking lot, they found his laptop, photographs, park maps, his wallet containing $447 in cash. Everything you'd expect to find. The wallet still had his driver's license and credit cards. The laptop was password protected. The photographs showed various parks he'd visited over the years, smiling pictures of a man who seemed to enjoy traveling and seeing natural wonders. Nothing suggested he was suicidal or having a mental health crisis. But they also found something else, a small book of handwritten poems. The book was one of those inexpensive journals you can buy at any bookstore, the kind with an ornate cover and blank pages inside. Ilhun Ro had filled about half of it with poems. The investigators who first looked through the book said the poems were dark, disturbing. They were about fire and water and the earth opening up. They were about hearing voices calling from beneath the ground. They were about surrendering to something vast and ancient. They were about going home to a place that existed before humans walked the earth. The Park Service has never released the contents of that book to the public. When Ilhun Ro's distant relatives were contacted, they were given his other belongings, but not the journal. The official reason was that it was evidence in an ongoing investigation. The unofficial reason, according to one ranger who saw the journal, was that the poems were so disturbing that park officials didn't want them getting out and starting rumours about Yellowstone being haunted, or cursed, or dangerous in ways beyond the obvious physical dangers. Since 1890, 22 people have died after falling into Yellowstone's hot springs. That's more than the number of people killed by bears and bison combined. But here's what makes these deaths different from regular accidents. Most of the victims showed no signs of distress beforehand, no indication they were suicidal, no evidence of being intoxicated or impaired, no witnesses reporting that they seemed confused or disoriented. They simply walked up to a boiling pool of water and went in. Take Colin Scott, for example. On June 7, 2016, the 23-year-old from Portland, Oregon, visited Norris Geyser Basin with his sister, Sable. Norris is one of the hottest and most active thermal areas in Yellowstone. The water there can reach 199 degrees. The springs are acidic, with pH levels low enough to eat through organic material. It's a beautiful but alien landscape, with steam rising everywhere and mineral deposits creating bizarre formations and colours you don't see anywhere else on Earth. Colin and Sable left the designated boardwalk and walked 225 feet into a prohibited area. They were looking for a place to soak, what some people call hot potting. It's illegal in Yellowstone because it's incredibly dangerous, but people do it anyway, looking for thermal pools that are warm but not boiling, places where you can sit in naturally heated water and feel like you're in a giant bathtub. When they reached a thermal pool, Colin bent down to check the water temperature. He slipped and fell in. Or, that's what the official report says. But Sable's statement to rangers suggests it might have been something else. She said Colin had been acting strangely that morning. He'd been insistent about going off the boardwalk, even though she'd argued against it. When she asked why he wanted to go into a prohibited area, he said he heard something calling from the thermal features. She thought he was joking, making up an excuse to justify doing something he knew was wrong. But maybe he wasn't joking. The water was 199 degrees. His sister tried to help, screaming for someone to call for assistance, but there was nothing anyone could do. By the time rangers reached the scene, Colin's body had completely dissolved. The heat and the acidity had worked that fast. There was nothing left to recover. The pool had consumed him entirely, broken down his tissue and bones into elements that dispersed into the water, becoming part of the thermal system. Sable Scott filmed part of their journey on her phone before the accident. The footage was reviewed by investigators and then sealed. According to rangers who saw it, Colin was walking toward the thermal area with purpose, not like someone casually exploring or looking for a place to soak. He was walking like someone who knew exactly where he needed to go, like someone following directions only he could hear. A retired ranger I'll call David Hartley agreed to speak with me on condition of anonymity. He worked in Yellowstone's backcountry for 28 years before retiring in 2023. We met at a coffee shop in Livingston, Montana, about an hour north of the park. Hartley is in his early 60s now, weathered by decades of outdoor work, with the kind of lean, tough build that comes from hiking thousands of miles with a heavy pack. When we sat down, he brought a file folder with him. Inside were photocopies of documents he wasn't supposed to have kept when he retired. "I'm breaking about a dozen Park Service regulations by showing you these," Hartley said, sliding the folder across the table. "But I figure at this point people need to know. The official story we tell tourists, it's not the whole truth. Hell, it's barely a fraction of the truth." He opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It was an incident report, the kind rangers file after responding to emergencies or unusual situations. This one was dated winter 2017. The report described an incident involving a missing cross-country skier in the Thoroughfare region, one of the most remote areas of Yellowstone. The Thoroughfare is so far from roads that even rangers rarely patrol it. It's genuine wilderness, the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another person. Rangers had found the skier's tracks leading toward the Heart Lake thermal area. Heart Lake is a beautiful spot in winter, surrounded by snow-covered peaks, with steam rising from hot springs around the shoreline. The tracks were clear and easy to follow in the fresh snow. The skier had been using classic cross-country technique, leaving parallel grooves in the snow. The tracks were methodical, evenly spaced, showing no signs of distress or hurry. Then the tracks just stopped. They ended at the edge of a hot spring, at a point where the snow had melted away to reveal dark, wet ground and wisps of steam. But according to the report, the tracks didn't show any hesitation. There were no marks where someone had tried to stop or turn around, no disruption in the pattern suggesting someone had realized they were approaching danger. The ski tracks walked straight toward the steam, straight toward the deadly hot water, and then just ended. The skier's body was never recovered. The hot spring he'd approached was one of those deceptive ones that looks solid on top because of mineral deposits and algae growth, but underneath is boiling water. Step on that crust, and it collapses, dropping you into water that can hit 180 degrees or more. Death is instantaneous. The body sinks and starts breaking down immediately. But his ski poles were found 200 yards away from the hot spring, in the opposite direction from where his tracks had come. The poles were planted upright in the snow, perfectly vertical, perfectly parallel to each other, spaced exactly 2 feet apart, as if someone had carefully measured the distance and deliberately placed them there. That detail bothered me, Hartley said, tapping the report with his finger. Bothered all of us who saw it, because if the guy fell through the crust into the hot spring, how did his poles end up 200 yards away, and who placed them like that? We searched the area, no other tracks, no other people. Just those 2 poles, standing there in the snow like sentinels. Hartley pulled out another document. This one was from the summer of 2019, 3 months before Stuart Isaac's disappearance at Craig Pass. A group of hikers at Shoshone Lake had reported seeing something strange while camping on the North Shore. It was around 10 p.m., full dark, no moon. They were sitting around their campfire when one of them noticed something in the lake, a light under the water. Not a reflection from their fire or from stars, an actual light source coming from below the surface of the lake, from somewhere deep. The hikers watched it for about 20 minutes. They described it as greenish blue, the colour of certain deep-sea fish or bioluminescent plankton, except much brighter. It pulsed slowly, getting brighter and dimmer in a regular rhythm, like something breathing. At first they thought maybe it was some kind of underwater flashlight, maybe a diver or researcher working at night, but the light was too deep. It had to be at least 50 feet down, maybe more, and it covered too large an area, maybe 20 feet across. Eventually the light faded and went out. The hikers reported it the next day when they got back to civilization. Rangers investigated but found nothing. However, thermal monitoring equipment in the area, sensors that constantly measure underground water temperature for geological research, recorded something unusual that same night. At exactly the time the hikers saw the light, the underground water temperature suddenly spiked. The temperature jumped 40 degrees higher than normal, from about 160 degrees to 200 degrees. The spike lasted for exactly 20 minutes, matching the duration the hikers said they'd seen the light, and then the temperature returned to normal. Geologists who reviewed the data couldn't provide an explanation. Temperature spikes in geothermal systems usually happen gradually as hot water migrates through rock fractures, or they happen during seismic events when earthquakes create new pathways for water to flow. They don't just spike suddenly for 20 minutes and then return to normal. That's not how geothermal systems work. Unless something down there turned on and then turned off again, Hartley said quietly, like a machine, or like something waking up for a few minutes and then going back to sleep. The third document was the most disturbing. In 2015, the Park Service installed wildlife cameras near Craig Pass to monitor bear populations. The cameras were motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use, designed to photograph animals passing by. The cameras were positioned on game trails and near areas where bears were known to feed, set to take a photo whenever something moved in front of the sensor. On September 23, 2015, exactly 5 years before Stuart Isaac's disappearance, one of the cameras captured something that had nothing to do with bears. The footage showed a man walking toward the camera at 3:17 in the morning. He was alone, walking down the Grand Loop Road, not on any trail. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans and a jacket. Nothing unusual. He appeared to be in his 30s or 40s. He was walking purposefully, not wandering or stumbling, moving with the steady gait of someone who knows exactly where they're going. But something about his movement was wrong. His stride was too stiff, like his knees didn't bend quite right. His arms didn't swing naturally at his sides. They hung straight down, barely moving, as if he'd forgotten that arms are supposed to swing when you walk. He moved like someone who'd learned to walk by watching videos of people walking, someone who understood the mechanics, but not the natural flow of human movement. The man passed the camera and headed east, toward the thermal areas on that side of Craig Pass. The camera captured him clearly for about 3 seconds as he walked through its field of view, and then he was gone into the darkness. 30 minutes later, the same camera captured him again, but this time he was walking backwards. Not walking normally while facing backward, but actually walking backwards, moving in reverse, his body oriented the wrong direction. The same stiff, mechanical gait, walking backwards down the road, away from the thermal area, back toward where he'd come from. On the return trip, his face was visible in the camera's infrared light. The camera's night vision mode uses infrared LEDs to illuminate the scene, invisible to human eyes but captured by the camera sensor. And in that infrared light, clear as day in the footage, the man's eyes were reflecting the camera's light. They glowed bright white, the way animal eyes do when you shine a light at them at night. That's called eye shine, caused by a reflective layer behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum. Cats have it, dogs have it, deer have it, most nocturnal animals have it, but humans don't. Human eyes don't have a tapetum lucidum. Human eyes don't reflect light like that. When you take a flash photograph of a person at night, their pupils might appear red from blood vessels in the retina, but they don't glow white, they don't shine like animal eyes. The ranger who first reviewed the footage, a young woman who was part of the wildlife monitoring team, was disturbed enough to file a formal report. She included screenshots from the video showing the man's eyes. The report was reviewed by her supervisor, who agreed it was unusual. The report was then forwarded up the chain of command, and then it vanished into whatever filing system the park uses for things they don't want to think about too hard. The man in the video was never identified. The Park Service posted a notice asking if anyone knew who he might be, but no one came forward. The footage was filed away and forgotten by most people, until Stuart Isaac disappeared from that exact same location 5 years later, almost to the day. Hartley spread a map across the table between us. It was a topographic map of Yellowstone, the kind with elevation contours and trail markers, and all the geographic features labelled. But Hartley had added his own annotations. The map was covered in coloured pins and handwritten notes. Red pins for disappearances, blue pins for thermal deaths, yellow pins for what he called anomalous incidents, things that didn't fit normal explanations, green pins for places where rangers had reported unusual sounds or experiences. "I've been tracking this for 15 years, Hartley said, his voice low so the other coffee shop customers couldn't hear. Every disappearance I heard about, every unexplained death, every strange report that came through the ranger stations. I started mapping them after I found 3 separate reports of missing people at Craig Pass over a 10-year period. I thought maybe there was something about that location specifically. Maybe the geography was confusing and people got disoriented. Maybe there were hidden thermal features that were dangerous. I don't know what I thought. I just wanted to understand." He tapped the map with his finger, tracing the pattern of pins. But when you map them out, when you see them all together, you start to notice something. They're not random. They form a pattern. I looked at the map closely. Hartley was right. The pins formed concentric circles like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped in water. The circles weren't perfect, they were irregular, distorted by the geography of the park, but the pattern was clear once you saw it. All the pins, all the incidents, radiated out from a central point. The center was beneath Yellowstone Lake, in the southern part of the lake, directly above what geologists call the Yellowstone caldera. The caldera is the collapsed crater of an ancient supervolcano, the largest magma chamber in North America. "There's something down there," Hartley said. His eyes locked on mine. "I don't know what it is. I don't think anyone knows. I'm not even sure it's something we have words for. But it's there, and it's been there for a very long time. And every few years, it reaches up through the thermal system and touches someone, calls to them, pulls them in. Yellowstone sits on top of one of the world's largest supervolcanoes. That's not a secret. It's well documented, studied by geologists from around the world. The magma chamber beneath the park is 30 miles long and 50 miles wide, a vast reservoir of molten rock sitting just a few miles below the surface. It's filled with magma hot enough to melt steel, under pressure that could drive material hundreds of miles into the atmosphere if it erupted. Scientists estimate the last major eruption was about 640,000 years ago. When it blew, it covered half of North America in ash. Above that magma chamber, heated by that enormous source of energy, there's an incredibly complex network of hydrothermal features, underground rivers of superheated water, some of it reaching 400 degrees or more, caves formed by ancient lava tubes, some mapped, most not, thermal vents that connect to depths we've never been able to explore, fractures in the rock where water and steam and gases escape to the surface. It's the most active geothermal system in the world, more hot springs and geysers than all other geothermal areas on Earth combined. In 2018, the United States Geological Survey conducted detailed seismic mapping of the Yellowstone caldera. They were trying to better understand the volcano's plumbing system, to predict how an eruption might behave if it happened again. The technique they used is called seismic tomography. They measure how earthquake waves travel through the Earth, and by analyzing the speed and direction of those waves, they can create three-dimensional images of what's underground. It's like a CT scan of the planet. The data they collected showed exactly what they expected. They could see the magma chamber, a large blob of partially molten rock. They could see the overlying rock layers, fractured and altered by heat and water. They could see the major hydrothermal features, places where water had carved out cavities and channels. But the data also showed something else. Anomalies, places where the seismic waves behaved strangely, as if they were passing through empty space or through material that had different properties than rock or water or magma. The anomalies appeared as dark spots in the tomographic images, voids in the data where something should have been but wasn't. The largest anomaly was directly beneath Yellowstone Lake, at a depth of about 2 miles, far below the hydrothermal system and above the main magma chamber. A chamber or cavity roughly a mile across, existing in a place where geological theory said there should only be solid rock. The USGS published their findings in a technical journal. The paper was thorough and professional, full of graphs and charts and careful language. The anomalies were mentioned in a section discussing the limitations of seismic tomography and areas where the data quality was poor. The paper suggested the anomalies might be artifacts of the measurement technique, quirks in how the computer algorithms processed the data. Further research was recommended, but buried in the supplementary materials, in an appendix that most people never read, one of the geologists noted something unusual. The anomaly beneath Yellowstone Lake appeared to be hollow. The seismic waves weren't just passing through weird rock or hot water. They were passing through empty space, a cavity, a chamber, something that shouldn't exist but does. I talked to one of the geologists on that research team, Hartley told me. Off the record, years after the study was published. He was retired by then, didn't have to worry about his career anymore. He told me they couldn't make sense of that chamber. The pressure at that depth should have collapsed any cavity. The heat should have caused the rock to flow and fill any empty space. But it's there. They measured it from multiple angles. It's real. Hartley leaned back in his chair. He said something else. He said when they were analysing the data, they noticed the chamber seemed to pulse. Not like a regular geological rhythm, not like magma convection or water circulation. It pulsed irregularly, like something breathing, like something alive. Something is down there beneath Yellowstone. something that creates spaces in the rock where spaces shouldn't exist, something that affects water temperature in ways that don't follow geological laws, something that, on rare occasions, reaches up through the thermal features and touches the world above. Before Yellowstone became America's first national park in 1872, the area was known to multiple Native American tribes. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Bannock, the Shoshone, and others all knew these lands. They hunted elk and bison in the surrounding forests and meadows. They gathered plants for medicine and food. They passed through on trading routes that connected different regions, but they avoided the thermal basins. They avoided the areas where the earth exhales steam and the water boils from below. They called the region the Burning Mountains and believed that something dangerous lived among the geysers. Early white explorers and traders heard these stories and dismissed them as primitive superstition, the kind of thing you'd expect from people who didn't understand geology and hydrothermal activity. But what if it wasn't superstition? What if the tribes knew something we've forgotten? What if they'd learned, over thousands of years of living near Yellowstone, that there was something there that was best left alone? In 1872, when Yellowstone was officially established as the first national park in the world, government officials held meetings with tribal leaders to discuss the boundaries and the rules. One of those leaders was Chief Washakie of the Shoshone, a respected war chief and diplomat who'd worked with the government on multiple treaties. According to the journal of one of the officials present at the meeting, Chief Washakie listened patiently as the white men explained their plans for the park. Then he spoke. "The earth breathes there," Chief Washakie said. "Do not disturb what breathes beneath. Do not build where the water boils. Do not send your people to camp near where the ground steams. The earth there is old and it dreams, and its dreams are not for men to see." The officials thanked him for his input and promptly ignored everything he said. They had a national park to build, after all, hotels to construct, roads to lay, tourists to attract. Within a year, there were cabins and lodges near thermal features. Within 5 years, there were boardwalks built right over hot springs, so visitors could get close enough to look down into the boiling water. Within 10 years, people were throwing objects into geysers to see if they'd erupt, washing clothes in hot springs, bathing in warm pools. And within a year of the park's establishment, the first thermal death was recorded. In 1890, an official report documented the death of a 7-year-old boy from Livingston, Montana, who fell into a hot spring while playing near the edge. He was the first official thermal fatality, but he would not be the last. Since then, 22 more people have died the same way. Hartley explained how the Park Service handles unusual disappearances. The protocol has evolved over the decades, refined as the Park Service gained more experience with backcountry search and rescue. When someone goes missing in Yellowstone, the initial response is standard. Mobilize search teams, establish a search area based on the person's last known location and their planned route, use helicopters and ground teams and search dogs, follow the established wilderness search and rescue protocols. But if the disappearance is what they've come to call anomalous, if certain specific criteria are met, then a different protocol kicks in. The criteria aren't written down in any public document. They're not part of the official search and rescue training. They're passed along verbally from senior rangers to junior rangers, part of the institutional knowledge that exists outside the policy manuals. An anomalous disappearance is one where the person vanishes near a thermal feature, where there are no tracks or evidence showing where they went, where the circumstances don't make logical sense, where witnesses report unusual behavior before the disappearance, where the victim is found, if they're found at all, in a location that doesn't match where they should have been. When a disappearance is classified as anomalous, a special team is called in. The rangers who make up this team aren't listed as park rangers on any official roster. They don't have their names on the Park Service website. They don't give presentations at visitor centres or lead educational programs. They arrive quietly, usually within 24 hours of the classification, driving unmarked vehicles. They don't wear standard Park Service uniforms. Some of them wear plain clothes. Some wear tactical gear without insignia. The team conducts its own investigation parallel to the official search and rescue operation. They interview witnesses. They examine the scene. They take samples of soil and water. They use instruments that aren't part of standard ranger equipment, and when they're done, they leave as quietly as they arrived. Whatever they find, whatever conclusions they reach, goes into reports that are filed separately from the normal incident reports. Those reports are not available through Freedom of Information Act requests. They're not stored in regular Park Service databases. They exist somewhere else in some other system, accessible only to people with specific clearances. Stuart Isaac's case file was classified as anomalous and sealed. Kim Crumbo's case file was classified as anomalous and sealed. The 2017 cross-country skier who walked into the hot spring at Heart Lake, anomalous and sealed. The 2014 woman from California whose rental car was found at Craig Pass, anomalous and sealed. They tried to keep Il-Hunro's death quiet too, tried to handle it as a routine if tragic thermal fatality, but the employee who found the shoe floating in the abyss pool was a seasonal worker, a young kid from back east who'd taken a summer job in Yellowstone because he liked hiking and thought it would be cool to work in a national park. He didn't know about the protocols. He didn't know he was supposed to call a specific number when he found evidence of thermal deaths. He just called his supervisor and said, "Hey, there's a shoe with a foot in it, floating in the abyss pool." By the time the special team arrived, word had already spread through the park's employee community. Someone posted about it on social media. A local news station picked it up. The story got out before it could be contained. "I've been in the backcountry at night," Hartley told me, his voice dropping even lower. "Alone near the thermal basins. Sometimes you're out there for 8 or 9 days on patrol, just you and your pack, checking on trails and campsites, making sure hikers aren't doing anything stupid. And at night, after you've eaten your freeze-dried dinner and you're sitting by your campfire, if you're near one of the thermal areas, you can hear it." "Hear what?" I asked. "The earth breathing, just like Chief Washakie said. If you're quiet enough, if you turn off your headlamp and let the darkness settle in, you can hear this low sound. It comes from below, from deep underground. It's rhythmic. In and out, like something huge and slow taking breaths." Hartley stared at his coffee cup. "But it's not just breathing. That's what gets me. It's like something's dreaming down there. Sometimes you'll hear other sounds mixed in with the breathing. Murmurs. Fragments of sound that almost form words but not quite. And on some nights when the moon is dark and the thermal features are especially active, you'll feel this pull, this urge to walk toward the steam, to get closer to the hot springs, to see what's down there in the water." He looked up at me. "That's when you know it's time to leave. When you feel that pull, you pack up your gear and you hike out, even if it's the middle of the night. Because if you stay, if you let that pull get stronger, you might end up like the others. You might find yourself walking toward a hot spring at 3 a.m, not really sure why, knowing it's dangerous but not caring, knowing you shouldn't go closer but unable to stop yourself. The thermal features aren't just geological phenomena. They're not just holes in the ground where hot water comes up. They're doorways, connections between our world and whatever exists down there in the depths. And sometimes those doorways open and people see things that make them walk into boiling water thinking they're walking home, things that make them take off their life jackets and swim out into freezing lakes, things that make them drive 32 hours from Maryland to park at Craig Pass and walk into the wilderness at night. There's been an escalation since 2010, more disappearances happening more frequently, more thermal deaths with circumstances that don't quite add up, more incidents where rangers respond to reports of people acting strangely near thermal features, people standing at the edge of hot springs staring down into the water, people who don't respond when you call to them, people whose eyes don't quite focus when you get their attention. The park itself is changing too. Seismic activity has been increasing gradually over the past decade. Small earthquakes that rattle windows and knock pictures off walls in towns around the park. Nothing big enough to cause serious damage, but more frequent than they used to be. The thermal features are changing as well. Geysers that used to erupt on predictable schedules are now irregular. Old Faithful, the most famous geyser in the world, the one that's been erupting approximately every 90 minutes for as long as anyone has kept records, isn't as faithful anymore. Sometimes it goes 2 hours between eruptions, sometimes only 60 minutes. The intervals are less predictable. New hot springs are appearing in places where there weren't hot springs before. In 2019, hikers reported finding a previously unknown thermal area in the backcountry near Heart Lake. Rangers investigated and confirmed that yes, there were now several hot springs and a small geyser in an area that had shown no thermal activity the previous year. The ground there had been solid and cold. Now it was hot and dangerous. Something is changing beneath Yellowstone. The rangers know it. They see the evidence every day. They feel it when they patrol the backcountry. They know something fundamental is shifting in the geothermal system, but they're not allowed to talk about it publicly because the Park Service doesn't want to start a panic. Hartley pulled one last document from his folder. It was an internal memo printed on Park Service letterhead, dated March 2023. The memo was marked for internal use only, not for public release. The subject line read, "Updated Thermal Behavioural Protocols." It was sent to all senior rangers in the park, all the people who supervise search and rescue operations or manage backcountry patrols. I read through the memo while Hartley watched me. The language was bureaucratic and carefully worded, the kind of official prose that says a lot without saying anything directly. But the implications were clear once you understood what you were reading. The memo outlined new procedures for handling visitors found near thermal features, who are displaying what it called altered behavioural states. The instructions were specific. If you encounter a visitor near a thermal feature who appears disoriented or unresponsive, do not engage verbally. Speaking to them might cause them to become agitated or might accelerate whatever process is affecting them. Do not make sudden movements. Approach slowly and quietly. Call for the specialised response team immediately using the emergency code designated for these situations. The code was listed, Code Thermal 7. If the visitor enters a thermal feature, do not attempt rescue. This was underlined in the memo. Do not attempt rescue. Maintain your distance, ensure other visitors stay back, and wait for the specialised team. Document everything, but do not intervene. And then there was the line that made my blood run cold, the line that suggested the Park Service had seen this enough times that they'd developed specific protocols for it. If visitors' eyes appear reflective or non-responsive to light, maintain distance of at least 50 feet and await specialised team arrival. Do not approach under any circumstances. Reflective eyes, like the man in the wildlife camera footage from Craig Pass, like the reports from rangers who'd encountered people standing at the edges of hot springs at night, people whose eyes glowed when flashlight beams hit them. "This memo acknowledges something," Hartley said, tapping the paper. "It acknowledges that people are being affected by something near the thermal features, that whatever's happening, it's happening often enough that they needed to create official protocols for dealing with it. They've seen enough incidents, enough people with those reflective eyes, enough people who walk into hot springs despite all the warning signs and the rangers yelling at them to stop." Hartley gathered up the documents and put them back in the folder. "I don't know what's down there," he said. "I've thought about it for 15 years. I've come up with a dozen theories and discarded them all because none of them fit all the evidence. But I know it's real, I know it's getting more active, and I know the Park Service is aware of it and trying to manage it quietly while keeping tourists coming and spending money." He stood up to leave. "Be careful if you go to Yellowstone," he said. "Stay on the boardwalks. Don't go near thermal features at night. And if you start to feel that pull, that urge to get closer to the hot water, turn around and walk away. Because once it has your attention, once it starts calling to you, it's very hard to resist." During the 3-week search for Kim Crumbo, the operation eventually reached a point where they had to use technical diving teams. Shoshone Lake is deep and cold, difficult diving conditions even for experienced divers. But Kim's brother had been found dead on the shore and Kim himself was missing, so they had to search the lake thoroughly. Maybe Kim had drowned and his body had sunk. Maybe he'd become disoriented in the cold water and swam the wrong direction, going deeper instead of toward shore. It was a long shot, but they had to look. The dive teams worked in shifts, systematically searching the areas where the canoe had been found and then expanding outward. The water was clear but dark at depth, visibility maybe 30 feet even with powerful diving lights. The bottom of the lake was covered with silt and fallen trees, difficult terrain to search. The temperature at depth was even colder than at the surface, cold enough that the divers could only stay down for short periods before hypothermia became a risk. In the deeper parts of the lake, The divers reported something strange. They found areas where the water temperature suddenly increased. Not gradually, the way you'd expect from a thermal current, but suddenly, as if there were invisible boundaries where cold water stopped and warm water began. These warm pockets were scattered across the lake bottom at depths of 60 to 80 feet. The temperature inside the pockets was around 70 degrees, warm enough to be comfortable compared to the 48-degree water surrounding them. Thermal vents. Shoshone Lake sits above the same geothermal system that feeds the hot springs and geysers on the surface. It makes sense that there would be underwater thermal features too. But what was unusual was how localized the warm areas were. They didn't spread out or mix with the cold water the way you'd expect. They stayed in discrete pockets, as if something was containing them. One of the dive teams found the source of one of these warm pockets, a cavity in the rock at the bottom of the lake, an opening roughly 6 feet in diameter, like a cave entrance with warm water flowing out of it. The diver shined his light into the cavity and saw that it extended downward at a steep angle, maybe 45 degrees, going deeper than his light could reach. The walls of the cavity were smooth, not jagged like most underwater caves. They looked almost polished, as if something had been moving through them regularly for a very long time. The diver, a man named Tom Chen, who'd been doing technical diving for 20 years, started to swim into the opening to explore it. But his dive partner, stationed a few feet away as a safety precaution, immediately grabbed his fin and pulled him back. Later, when they surfaced and were debriefing on the boat, the dive partner explained why he'd stopped Chen from going into the cavity. "I don't know," the dive partner said. "I just knew we shouldn't go in there. Something felt wrong about it. The opening was too perfect, too smooth, and when I looked at it, when I really focused on it, I felt this urge to swim away as fast as possible, like every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from that hole in the rock." Chen agreed with his partner's decision. He said that as soon as he'd pointed his light into the cavity, he'd felt strange, dizzy, confused about which direction was up. His breathing had become irregular inside his regulator, faster than it should have been. All signs that something was wrong, that he needed to ascend, so they'd marked the location on their dive computers and returned to the surface. That cavity was noted in the internal search reports. A sketch was made showing its location relative to the shore and to depth markers. There was discussion about sending a remote-operated vehicle down to explore it, one of those small submarines with cameras that can go deeper and stay down longer than human divers. But the discussion never went anywhere. The decision was made to focus search efforts on areas where Kim Crumbo was more likely to be found, closer to shore, in shallower water. The cavity was filed away as an interesting geological feature, but not relevant to the search. The cavity was never explored further. The search for Kim Crumbo eventually ended with no answers. His body has never been found. His family held a memorial service in 2022, a year after his disappearance, even though there was no body to bury. His wife still visits Shoshone Lake sometimes, usually in the early fall when the aspens are turning gold and the lake is quiet. She walks the shoreline where Mark's body was found, where Kim's life jacket was discovered, hoping maybe this time she'll find some sign of what happened. One of the rangers who participated in that search, a man I spoke with on condition of anonymity, told me something that's haunted him ever since. On the last day of the official search, October 8th, before the winter snows shut down all operations, he was assigned to do one final sweep of the eastern shore. It was just him and one other ranger, hiking along the beach, checking under logs and behind rocks, doing one last look for any sign of Kim Crumbo. The other ranger had gone ahead, maybe 50 yards up the beach. The first ranger stopped to check a dense patch of willows near the waterline, thinking maybe Kim had made it to shore but collapsed in the bushes. He was pushing through the willows when he noticed something in the mud at the edge of the water. Footprints, adult-sized barefoot prints, clearly defined in the wet mud. Fresh. They couldn't have been more than a day or two old. But that didn't make sense. The search area had been officially closed to the public for 3 weeks. No one was supposed to be there except search personnel, and everyone was accounted for. All the searchers wore boots. No one was walking around barefoot. The ranger followed the prints. They led from the beach toward the water, walking across the narrow strip of mud that marked the lake's current level. The prints were methodical, evenly spaced, showing no signs of hesitation or uncertainty. They walked straight toward the water like someone taking a purposeful morning stroll to go swimming. The prints reached the water's edge and continued into the lake. The ranger could see them clearly through the shallow water near shore, pressed into the sand and silt of the lake bottom. He waded in a few steps, following the prints, watching them extend deeper and deeper into the lake until the water got too deep to see the bottom anymore. He stood there in the cold water, which was already soaking through his boots and making his feet ache, looking at where the prints disappeared into the depths. He thought about Kim Crumbo, who'd been missing for nearly a month by that point. He thought about the life jacket found on the shore. He thought about his brother Mark, who died of hypothermia in this same water. And he thought about those footprints, walking calmly into the freezing lake as if someone were going for a pleasant swim on a summer day. He never filed a report about those footprints. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him, and he wasn't sure what the report would even say. But he thinks about them sometimes, especially on the nights when he can't sleep. He wonders if maybe, somehow, Kim Crumbo had walked into that freezing water of his own accord. If maybe he'd taken off his life jacket deliberately, placed it carefully on the shore, and then walked into the lake, walked in, and kept walking, down into the dark and the cold, following something only he could see, following something that had been calling to him from beneath the water. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a legendary backcountry ranger in Yellowstone named Bob Jackson. His friends called him Action Jackson because of his aggressive enforcement of backcountry regulations. He was the kind of ranger who hiked hundreds of miles every summer, covering the most remote areas of the park, making sure illegal outfitters weren't setting up camps and poachers weren't killing wildlife. He was tough, experienced, a man who knew the wilderness as well as anyone alive. Bob Jackson had an experience in the late 1970s that he never spoke about publicly until he retired in 2004. Even then, he only talked about it reluctantly, usually when someone asked him directly about strange things he'd seen in his decades of backcountry work. He was patrolling the Fan Creek drainage in Yellowstone's northwest corner, one of the most remote areas of the park. It's wild country up there, grizzly bear habitat, miles from any road. Bob was on horseback, traveling with a pack string, the way backcountry rangers did in those days before ATVs and helicopters made everything easier. It was early morning, maybe 6 a.m., with fog still hanging in the valley. He was riding along when he heard a sound. At first, he thought it was elk. It was autumn, the rut season, and bull elk bugling is one of the most distinctive sounds in nature. But this wasn't quite right. It was similar to elk bugling, but wrong somehow. Too loud, too constant. Instead of the brief calls that elk make, this was continuous, filling the entire valley, echoing off the mountains. Bob stopped his horse and listened. The sound went on for maybe 5 minutes, this long, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made his horse nervous. The animal kept dancing sideways, ears pinned back, wanting to run. The pack horses behind him were acting up too, pulling at their lead ropes. When the sound finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. The birds had stopped singing. The usual forest sounds, the rustle of small animals, the wind in the trees, all of it was gone. Just dead silence, like the world was holding its breath. Bob never figured out what made that sound. He asked the outfitter he was patrolling with, a man who'd been guiding in Yellowstone for 30 years, if he'd heard anything like it before. The outfitter said no, and he looked spooked when he said it, like he didn't want to talk about it. 2 weeks later, Bob was out again, this time with 2 other rangers, patrolling the southeast arm area of Yellowstone Lake. They were on horseback, moving through a subalpine meadow, when Bob saw something moving through the trees on the far side of the clearing. At first he thought it was a bear. The colour was right, dark brown or black. The size was right, big enough to be a mature grizzly. But as he watched, Bob realised the proportions were wrong. The thing was walking upright on 2 legs, not on all fours like a bear. It was moving fast, covering ground quickly, using the trees and the terrain for cover like it knew it was being watched and was trying to get away. Bob had encountered countless bears during his thousands of miles on horseback through Yellowstone's backcountry. He knew what bears looked like, how they moved, how they behaved. This wasn't a bear. The thing disappeared into the forest before Bob could get a better look. He didn't say anything to the other rangers. He wasn't sure what he'd say. "Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot." He'd be laughed out of the ranger station. So he kept quiet and tried to convince himself it had been a bear standing on its hind legs, maybe trying to get a better view or reach something in a tree. But in the mid-1980s, Bob had another experience that made it harder to dismiss what he'd seen. He was on patrol in the southeast corner of the park with 3 other rangers. It was winter, and they were travelling on cross-country skis, checking on winter camping sites and making sure no one was doing anything illegal in the off-season. They were following a game trail when they came across footprints in the snow. The prints were human-like but enormous, maybe 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. They showed 5 toes like human feet, but the proportions were different. The stride was huge, maybe 6 feet between prints, longer than any human could manage walking normally. The prints went all the way down through 3.5 feet of snow, pressed deep into the frozen ground beneath, which meant whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Bob and the other rangers followed the prints for maybe a quarter mile before they veered off into terrain that was too steep and dangerous to follow on skis. They took photographs, though Bob told me the photos never came out well because it's hard to photograph footprints in snow without proper lighting and scale references. But all 4 rangers saw the prints. All 4 of them agreed the prints were real and couldn't be explained by any animal they knew. Bob started asking around after that. He talked to outfitters and guides who worked in the park. He talked to other rangers, carefully feeling out whether they'd seen or heard anything strange, and he discovered that he wasn't alone. Several other people had heard that strange bugling sound in Fan Creek. Several had seen large, upright figures moving through the forest at a distance. One illegal camper in the northeast section of Yellowstone described waking up in his tent to a noise right outside. Something big breathing heavily, close enough to touch the tent wall. When he'd worked up the courage to look outside the next morning, he'd found footprints in the soft earth around his camp. Big prints. Not bear, not human, something in between. Bob didn't know what to make of it all. He was a practical man, not given to believing in monsters or supernatural phenomena. But he also trusted his own observations. He'd seen what he'd seen. He'd heard what he'd heard. Something was out there in Yellowstone's backcountry. Something that didn't fit into the known categories of wildlife. Years later, after he retired, Bob came across reports of other strange things happening in Yellowstone. Reports of people disappearing near thermal features. Reports of people acting strangely before they vanished. And he started to wonder if maybe all of it was connected. Maybe the sounds in Fan Creek and the figure in the meadow and the footprints in the snow weren't separate phenomena. Maybe they were all manifestations of the same thing, whatever lies beneath Yellowstone, reaching up through different channels, showing itself in different ways. There's another phenomenon that's been reported in Yellowstone since the very first scientific expeditions explored the region in the 1870s. It's called the Yellowstone Lake music, and it's one of those things that's well documented but never adequately explained. In 1872, F.H. Bradley was part of the Hayden expedition, one of the early scientific surveys of Yellowstone. He was a geologist, trained to observe carefully and record what he saw without embellishment. On the morning of July 26, 1872, he and his colleagues were camped on the shore of Yellowstone Lake, preparing breakfast, when they heard something strange. Bradley wrote in his journal, "While getting breakfast, we heard every few moments a curious sound, between a whistle and a hoarse whine, whose locality and character we could not at first determine." The sound continued for maybe half an hour, coming and going, sometimes loud, sometimes faint. Bradley and the others walked around camp, trying to locate the source. It seemed to come from above the lake, or maybe from across the lake, or maybe from everywhere at once. It definitely wasn't coming from their camp or from any equipment they had. Eventually the sound faded and stopped, and they never heard it again during the rest of their expedition. Bradley's report of the sound was included in the official survey documents, and it might have been forgotten as a one-time oddity if other people hadn't reported the same thing over the following decades. In 1899, Captain Hiram Chittenden, an Army engineer who supervised road construction in Yellowstone, wrote in his journal about hearing strange and indefinable overhead sounds while camped at Yellowstone Lake. Chittenden was known for his precisely detailed and undramatic journals. He wasn't the type to exaggerate or imagine things, but he heard the sounds and documented them. Over the next century, Dozens of people reported hearing the Yellowstone Lake music. Park rangers heard it, tourists heard it, scientists heard it. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A musical tone somewhere between a whistle and a hum. Sometimes multiple tones at once, creating harmonics, seeming to come from the sky or from the lake or from nowhere identifiable, lasting anywhere from a few minutes to an hour before fading away. Scientists have proposed various explanations over the years. Maybe it's wind interacting with the landscape in unusual ways, creating acoustic effects. Maybe it's seismic activity, the sound of rock grinding beneath the lake transmitted up through the water. Maybe it's some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, temperature inversions creating sound channels that carry distant noises from miles away. But none of these explanations fully account for all the observations. The sound happens in calm conditions as well as windy conditions. It happens when there's no seismic activity. It happens with clear skies and stable atmospheres. And the quality of the sound, that musical, almost melodic character, doesn't match what you'd expect from natural geological or atmospheric processes. As recently as 2015, park rangers have reported hearing the lake music. A backcountry ranger named Christine Brunsman told a reporter that she'd heard it while skiing across Yellowstone Lake in winter. She was alone, miles from anyone, crossing the frozen lake under a clear winter sky. The sound started gradually, building from faint to loud, multiple tones weaving together into something that was almost a melody. It lasted for about 10 minutes, then faded away. She said it was beautiful and eerie and unlike anything she'd ever heard before. Rangers who work in the backcountry near Yellowstone Lake have reported something else too, something that's not in any of the official documentation or tourist literature. They report sounds coming from beneath the ground, rhythmic thumping like enormous slow breathing. The sounds are always heard near thermal features, always at night, always when the ranger is alone or with just one other person. One retired ranger I spoke with, a woman who'd spent 15 summers working backcountry patrols in the Lake District, told me about spending a night at the outlet cabin. This is a small ranger cabin near the outlet of Shoshone Lake, used as a base for patrols in that area. It's one of the most remote structures in Yellowstone, miles from any road, accessible only by hiking or paddling. She was alone in the cabin, which is not unusual for backcountry rangers. She'd eaten dinner, written up her patrol notes, and was getting ready for bed when she heard it start. A low thump. Pause. Another thump. Pause. Rhythmic, steady, like a heartbeat, but much slower. About one thump every 5 seconds. At first she thought maybe it was her own heartbeat, amplified somehow by the quiet. But when she held her breath and felt her pulse, she could tell it wasn't that. The thumping was external, coming from somewhere outside or below the cabin. She opened the door and stepped outside, thinking maybe it was a distant helicopter or machinery from park operations. But the sound was clearer outside. It was coming from beneath her feet, from deep in the earth. She stood there in the darkness, listening to the slow, steady thumping. It continued for 3 hours, from about midnight until 3 a.m., then suddenly stopped. The silence after it stopped was almost painful, like something vital had been turned off. She went back inside the cabin and lay awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that she'd heard something important, something that explained all the other strange things that happen in Yellowstone. The next morning, she hiked out and returned to the ranger station. She didn't file a report about the sounds. What would she say? That she'd heard the earth breathing? That something under Yellowstone Lake has a heartbeat? She'd sound crazy. So, she kept quiet like most rangers who experience strange things in the backcountry. You learn not to talk about it, because talking about it means people will think you're unreliable or making things up. But it happened. She heard it. And she knows other rangers have heard it too, even though nobody talks about it officially. There's a place in Yellowstone called Death Gulch. It's in the northeastern part of the park, in the Lamar River drainage, a narrow ravine that cuts through the forest. The name isn't an exaggeration. Things die there regularly. In 1888, Walter H. Weed, a member of that year's U.S. Geological Survey expedition, was exploring the area when he found 6 dead bears in the gulch. Along with the bears were an elk carcass and numerous smaller animals. Squirrels, birds, mice, all of them dead, lying on the ground or slumped against rocks. We'd examined the bodies and found no external wounds, no signs of violence or disease. The bears hadn't been fighting, the elk hadn't been killed by a predator. They'd all just died. We'd concluded that the animals had been asphyxiated by toxic gases. Death Gulch sits above a thermal area, and in certain weather conditions, heavier than air gases like carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide can seep out of vents in the ground and accumulate in low-lying areas. Animals wandering into these pockets of gas breathe it instead of air and suffocate. It's a known hazard in volcanic regions. The phenomenon has happened multiple times since then. In 2004, 5 dead bison were found at Norris Geyser Basin under similar circumstances. The official cause was gas asphyxiation from carbon dioxide accumulating in a depression where the bison were bedded down. Park geologists examined the scene and confirmed that gas levels in that area were high enough to be lethal. The bison had essentially suffocated in their sleep. But what the official reports don't mention is how the animals were positioned when they were found. This detail was left out of the incident report, either because it was considered unimportant or because someone decided it was better not to include it. But witnesses who saw the scene before it was cleaned up said the bison weren't scattered randomly the way you'd expect from animals that collapsed where they were lying. They were arranged in a perfect circle, all 5 of them, all facing inward toward a steam vent in the centre. One of the rangers who responded to that incident later told David Hartley that the positioning bothered him. Animals that die from gas asphyxiation should collapse where they stand or lie. Their muscles stop working, they lose consciousness, they fall over. They don't arrange themselves in geometric formations first. It doesn't make sense. Unless something else was happening, unless the gas asphyxiation was incidental, and the bison were actually responding to something else, some signal or call that made them arrange themselves that way. Unless they were already under some kind of influence when the gas killed them. That's speculation, of course. There's no proof of anything beyond what the official report says. 5 bison died of gas asphyxiation in an unfortunate but not unprecedented incident. The bodies were removed, the area was monitored for gas levels, warning signs were posted, and life went on. But the rangers who saw those bison arranged in their perfect circle haven't forgotten. They know what they saw, even if they can't explain it. I want to show you something that connects all of this together, that ties Stuart Isaac's disappearance to Kim Crumbo's vanishing, to the thermal deaths, to the strange sounds and sightings. Stuart Isaac's car still sits in an impound lot in Montana, in a secure facility outside of Bozeman. After the search was called off and the case went cold, the car was moved from Craig Pass to this facility where vehicles involved in unsolved cases are stored. It's been there for over a decade now, slowly accumulating dust in a warehouse alongside other vehicles from other mysteries. I managed to get access to the detailed inventory of items found in Stuart's car. It's a longer list than I initially mentioned, more thorough than what was released to the family. Standard procedure in missing persons cases is to catalogue everything, even items that seem insignificant. You never know what might become important later. The inventory includes the usual things: a road atlas with a route marked in pen from Maryland to Yellowstone, the line drawn carefully with a ruler, not deviating from the most direct interstate routes. Some snacks, mostly uneaten, protein bars, bags of trail mix, a half-empty bag of pretzels, water bottles, 3 of them, 2 empty and 1 half full, his phone, which investigators examined thoroughly. The call logs showed the 2-hour conversation with Matsui Evans and various other normal calls and texts in the days before he left. Nothing unusual, but there were other items that weren't mentioned in the initial reports. In the back seat, investigators found a sleeping bag, still in its stuff sack, with the tag still attached. Stuart had bought it new, presumably for this trip, but never used it. There was a camping stove, also new with tags, still in its box. A flashlight, a first aid kit, a tarp. All the gear you'd need for camping, all brand new, none of it opened or used. This suggests Stuart intended to camp. He'd bought the equipment, but he never made it to a campsite. He never unloaded the gear from his car. He parked at Craig Pass and walked into the woods with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. In the glove compartment, along with the car's registration and proof of insurance, there was a small spiral-bound notebook, the kind you can buy at any office supply store, maybe 3 inches by 5 inches, with a wire binding at the top. The first pages contained normal things: grocery lists, phone numbers of friends and co-workers, reminders about appointments and bills. The handwriting was neat, legible, organized. This was the notebook of someone who had their life together, someone who kept track of things. But starting about halfway through the notebook, around the entries dated late August 2010, about a week or two before Stuart left Maryland, the handwriting began to change. It became less neat. The letters were larger, more erratic. Some words were underlined multiple times, so hard that the pen had torn through the paper in places. The entries from late August were strange. Dreams every night about water, hot water, steam, can't see through the steam. And then, a few pages later, the sound is getting louder. I hear it even when I'm awake now, like breathing, but bigger, from underground. The entries got more disturbing as September approached. The water is calling. I can hear it even here, 2,000 miles away. How is that possible? And then, I can hear it breathing. I can hear it saying my name. Stuart, Stuart, come home. The last few entries made in the days just before Stuart left were barely readable. The handwriting was frantic, words running together, some of them just scrawled repetitions. I have to go down where the water comes from, down where it's been waiting. It knows my name. It's been calling for so long. How did I not hear it before? How did anyone not hear it? It's so loud now. So loud. I have to go. I have to go down. It's time to come home. The final entry, made on what must have been the morning of September 6th, the day he left, was just one line written in letters so large they took up an entire page. It's time. The Park Service psychiatrist who reviewed the notebook noted that the entries suggested a progressive psychotic break, possibly schizophrenia manifesting suddenly in middle age, though that's unusual. More likely, the psychiatrist speculated, Stuart had been experiencing symptoms for a while but hiding them, and they finally reached a point where he couldn't ignore them anymore. The references to hearing sounds and voices are classic auditory hallucinations. The belief that something was calling him from Yellowstone could be a delusional system, a constructed belief that made sense of the hallucinations he was experiencing. But Stuart Isaac had no history of mental illness, no previous psychiatric treatment, no family history of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. His co-workers said he'd been normal right up until he left. Maybe a little distracted in the week before he vanished, but nothing that suggested he was having a mental health crisis. He went to work on Friday, September 3rd, had a normal day, participated in a team meeting, ate lunch with co-workers. He talked about his weekend plans, which apparently didn't include driving to Wyoming. Then on Monday morning, September 6th, something made him get in his car and drive. Something made him ignore his job and his family and his normal life. Something called to him from Yellowstone, and he couldn't resist. 3 years after Stuart vanished in 2013, another vehicle was found at Craig Pass. A rental car, a small sedan parked in the same turnout where Stuart's Lexus had been. Keys in the ignition. Door unlocked. The renter was a woman from Sacramento, California, 36 years old, on vacation by herself, driving through Yellowstone on her way to see the geysers. She'd checked into a hotel in West Yellowstone 2 nights earlier. The hotel staff said she seemed normal, friendly, excited to be visiting the park. She'd asked for recommendations about what to see. They'd suggested Old Faithful, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and the Mammoth Hot Springs. She'd thanked them and said she was going to spend a few days exploring. The next morning, she checked out of the hotel, loaded her belongings into the rental car and drove into the park. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her car was found 3 days later at Craig Pass. She was never seen again. No body, no evidence of where she'd gone. Just another car in the same parking lot, another person who walked into the wilderness and vanished. Her belongings were in the car, her suitcase, her laptop, her wallet with cash and credit cards. And in the front seat, investigators found a journal. The woman had been keeping a travel journal, recording her impressions of the places she visited. The entries from the first few days of her trip were cheerful, describing the drive from California, the beauty of the mountains, her excitement about seeing Yellowstone for the first time. But the last entry, written the night before she disappeared, was different. She wrote about having a strange dream the night before at the hotel. In the dream, she was swimming in a lake, Warm water, very pleasant. But as she swam, she realized the water was getting hotter. She tried to swim back to shore but couldn't find it. The water kept getting hotter and hotter until she woke up sweating and tangled in the hotel sheets. She wrote, "I can't stop thinking about that dream. It felt so real, and all day today while I was driving I kept feeling like I needed to go somewhere. Not Old Faithful or the Grand Canyon. Somewhere else. Somewhere off the main road. I know it doesn't make sense. I don't even know where I'm trying to go. But I feel it pulling at me, like something is waiting for me, like I have an appointment I forgot about, but now I'm late." That was the last entry. The next morning she drove to Craig Pass and disappeared. Her case file is sealed, classified as anomalous. In 2017, a Park Service employee, a young man who worked maintenance at one of the lodges, told his roommate he was going for a drive on his day off. He wanted to see some part of the park he hadn't visited yet. It was October, late in the season, and most of the park's roads were about to close for winter. He left in the morning and never came back. His truck was found at Craig Pass, keys in the ignition, door unlocked. He'd brought nothing with him, no hiking gear, no camping equipment, not even a jacket, which was foolish in October, when the weather can turn deadly without warning. Just walked away from his truck in jeans and a t-shirt and vanished into the wilderness. His roommate said he'd been acting strange for a few days before he disappeared. Quiet. Distracted. He'd stopped going out with friends after work. He'd been spending his evenings alone in his room, sitting in the dark, not answering when his roommate knocked to ask if he wanted dinner or wanted to watch TV. When the roommate asked if he was okay, he said he was fine, just tired, just wanted some quiet time. The roommate found a note in his room after he disappeared. Not a suicide note, just a piece of paper with one line scrawled on it. "Finally understand what they mean. The earth really does breathe." His case file is sealed, classified as anomalous. Something about Craig Pass is attracting people, or calling them. The frequency of disappearances there has been accelerating. Once every 10 or 15 years in the 1970s and 80s. Every 5 or 6 years in the 1990s. Every 3 or 4 years in the 2000s. And since 2010, every 2 or 3 years. The pattern is clear to anyone paying attention. Whatever is happening, there is getting stronger, reaching further, affecting more people. Last year, in 2024, there were 3 more disappearances in Yellowstone. Not all of them at Craig Pass, but all of them near thermal features. A hiker vanished from a trail near Norris Geyser Basin. His friend said he'd stopped to look at a hot spring, told them he'd catch up in a minute, and when they looked back 5 minutes later, he was gone. They retraced their steps immediately, calling his name, searching the area. He'd vanished in the 5 minutes they weren't watching him. A woman disappeared from a campground near Old Faithful. She'd been camping with her husband. He woke up in the morning and she wasn't in the tent. Her shoes were still there. Her jacket was still there. She'd walked away barefoot into the cold pre-dawn darkness. Search teams found her body 2 days later, miles from the campground, in a thermal area that was off limits and fenced off. She'd climbed over the fence and walked into a hot spring. The autopsy showed she was alive when she entered the water. A teenager on a class trip disappeared from the group while they were walking the boardwalks at Grand Prismatic Spring. The teacher said 1 minute he was there, taking pictures with his phone, and the next minute he was gone. They searched for him, thinking maybe he'd wandered off to use the bathroom or to get a better camera angle. They found him an hour later, standing at the edge of a hot spring off the boardwalk, his feet inches from the water. When rangers reached him and pulled him back, he didn't seem to understand where he was or how he'd gotten there. He couldn't remember leaving the group. 2 of those 3 people are dead. One of them was found wandering in the wilderness 3 days after disappearing, dehydrated and confused, but alive. All 3 case files mentioned thermal-related behavioral anomaly in the incident summaries. All 3 files have been flagged for review by the special team. The rangers see the pattern. They understand that something fundamental is happening, something that official statements and bureaucratic language can't explain away. But they're not allowed to talk about it publicly. There are protocols. There are non-disclosure agreements. There are career considerations. You don't talk about the things that might make tourists nervous, that might hurt the park's reputation, that might suggest Yellowstone is dangerous in ways that can't be mitigated with warning signs and safety protocols. So the disappearances continue, the files get sealed, the families are told that their loved ones made tragic mistakes, wandered off trail, got lost, fell into hot springs because they weren't paying attention, accidents, poor judgment, the unforgiving nature of wilderness. And the rangers go back to their patrols, watching the thermal features, noticing when people stare at them too long, noticing when visitors don't respond when you call their names, noticing when someone's eyes catch the light wrong. Last summer, I visited Yellowstone myself. I wanted to see Craig Pass, to stand where Stuart Isaac's car was found, to understand what might draw people to that particular spot. I drove the Grand Loop Road early on a Tuesday morning before most tourists were awake, when the park belongs to the few people willing to get up before sunrise. The road was nearly empty. I passed maybe 3 other vehicles during the hour it took to drive from West Yellowstone to Craig Pass. When I reached Craig Pass, I pulled into the turnout and stopped. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky shades of orange and pink. The air was cold at that elevation, cold enough that I could see my breath when I got out of the car. I stood there for a moment, just looking at the landscape. Dense lodgepole pine forest on all sides, the small wooden sign for Isa Lake, the boardwalk leading off into the trees. It was quiet, the kind of deep, profound quiet you only get in wilderness areas, where the absence of human noise lets you hear the world's natural sounds more clearly. I could hear wind moving through the pine needles, a soft susurration that rose and fell. I could hear birds calling in the distance, the sharp cries of Clark's nutcrackers harvesting pine seeds. I could hear a raven croaking somewhere to the south, and underneath it all, if I stood very still and listened carefully, I could hear something else, a low, rhythmic sound, like breathing, like something vast and ancient drawing air in and out, patient and eternal. In, out, in, out. About one breath every 15 seconds, slow enough that at first I thought I was imagining the pattern. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening. The breathing sound continued, steady and regular. And then I noticed something else. The air near my face felt warm, not from the sun, which was still low on the horizon, barely above the trees. This was a different kind of warmth rising from the ground, carrying with it a faint smell of sulfur. I looked down and realized I was standing on a thin crust of mineral deposits, white and yellow sulfur compounds, grey and orange iron oxides, the telltale signs of thermal activity. There was a vent right beneath my feet. Nothing dramatic, not a geyser or a visible hot spring. Just a small crack in the earth where warm air and steam escaped from the depth below. I stepped back quickly, suddenly aware of how fragile the ground was. The crust was maybe an inch thick at most. Underneath was heat, maybe just warm air from a small vent, maybe a cavity filled with steam, maybe a channel leading down to superheated water. I had no way to know. All I knew was that the ground beneath my feet was thin and hot and unstable. My heart was pounding, but underneath the fear, there was something else, a strange pull, a feeling that if I just stood there long enough, if I just listened carefully enough to that breathing sound, I would hear something calling my name. I would understand why Stuart Isaac had parked here. I would know where the woman from Sacramento had gone. I would feel what they felt, that irresistible urge to walk into the forest, to follow the steam, to find the source of the breathing. I got back in my car and drove away. But I understood then, in a way I hadn't before, how it happens. The thermal features aren't just geological curiosities, aren't just tourist attractions with pretty colours and dramatic eruptions. They're cracks in the world. They're places where the barrier between our reality and whatever exists beneath becomes thin enough to breach. They're places where something from below can reach up and touch the surface, and sometimes it reaches up and finds someone susceptible, someone whose mind is open to suggestions from the deep earth, someone who can hear the breathing, someone who can feel the pull. And once it finds you, once it starts calling your name, whispering in your dreams, making itself known in ways that bypass your conscious, rational mind, it's very hard to resist. Stuart Isaac's family still doesn't have answers. His mother died in 2019, never knowing what happened to her son. His sister, who still lives in Maryland, calls the Park Service every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. She asks if there's been any new information. The answer is always no, but she keeps calling, because what else can she do? He was her brother. He drove across the country and vanished, and no one can tell her why. Kim Crumbo's wife, Barbara, still visits Shoshone Lake sometimes. She usually goes in the fall when the crowds have thinned and the weather is turning cold. She hikes in with a backpack, camps on the shore where the search teams found Mark's body, where Kim's life jacket was discovered on the rocks. She sits by the water and talks to Kim, telling him about her life, about their friends, about the conservation battles being fought in his absence. She doesn't know if he can hear her. She doesn't know if he's at the bottom of the lake or if he's somewhere else entirely. But she comes back anyway, because that's the last place anyone saw him, and maybe some part of him is still there. Ilhunro's poems were never released to the public, but I spoke with one of the rangers who read them, who saw that journal before it was sealed in an evidence locker. He told me the poems were unlike anything he'd ever read. They weren't just dark or disturbing, they were detailed, specific. They described places beneath Yellowstone that shouldn't exist, caverns filled with hot water, channels carved through rock by forces other than geological processes. They described something living down there, something old enough to remember when the earth was young, something that dreams in the darkness and sometimes reaches up through the thermal features to touch human minds. The ranger said one poem in particular stuck with him. It was titled The Breathing, and it described the sound you can hear at night near thermal areas, that low rhythmic thumping. But in Ilhunro's poem, it wasn't just a sound, it was communication. The thing beneath Yellowstone breathing in a pattern, a code, a signal that certain people could interpret. And those people, the ones who understood the breathing, knew they had to respond, had to go down, had to find the source and give themselves to it. The ranger said he couldn't get that poem out of his head for weeks. He kept thinking about it when he was on patrol, especially at night near thermal areas. He'd hear that breathing sound and wonder if maybe Ilhunro had been right. Maybe it wasn't just geological noise. Maybe it really was communication, an ancient thing calling out in the darkness, waiting for someone who could understand. And every year, more people vanish in Yellowstone's backcountry. The official explanation remains the same: accidents, drownings, poor judgment. Nature is dangerous, and sometimes people make mistakes. It's tragic, but not mysterious. The Park Service releases statements expressing sympathy for the families and reminding visitors to stay on designated trails, to respect safety barriers, to exercise caution around thermal features. But the rangers know different. They see the sealed files piling up. They hear the stories from other rangers, the unofficial accounts that never make it into incident reports. They know about the special team that arrives when disappearances are classified as anomalous. They know about the memo with protocols for handling visitors with reflective eyes. They know about the patterns David Hartley mapped, the concentric circles radiating out from beneath Yellowstone Lake. They know that something ancient sleeps beneath the world's first national park, something that existed long before humans built roads and hotels and boardwalks, something that lived here when the landscape was nothing but lava flows and superheated gases, when the whole region was one enormous volcanic eruption reshaping the continent, something that went deep when the surface cooled, down into the magma and the rock, but left channels open, left pathways connecting its realm to the surface, left the thermal features as windows between worlds. And every thermal vent, every hot spring, every geyser is a place where that thing can reach up, where it can exhale into our atmosphere, where it can touch minds that are receptive, where it can call people home. If you visit Yellowstone, please stay on the boardwalks. The warning signs are there for a reason, and that reason isn't just that you might fall into boiling water. Don't go near the thermal features after dark, when the breathing is loudest and the pull is strongest. If you hear sounds you can't explain, if you feel that strange warmth rising from the ground, if you start to hear something whispering your name beneath the wind, leave immediately. Get in your car and drive away, and don't come back. And if someone you're with starts acting strange near the hot springs, if their eyes look wrong when light hits them, if they start walking toward the steam with that stiff mechanical gait, get help, but don't follow them. Call a ranger, call 911, but don't go after them. Because once the earth starts calling someone, once they hear that breathing sound and understand what it means, once they accept the invitation to go down into the depths, there's no bringing them back. They belong to Yellowstone then. They belong to whatever dreams in the darkness beneath the thermal features. They've gone home to a place that existed long before humans, to a place that will exist long after we're gone. This is Void Case Files, and we're just getting started. Hit subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers by New Year's. We're posting daily, bringing you the cases they don't want you to know. Drop a comment if you've experienced anything strange in Yellowstone or any national park. Share your stories, share your experiences. The truth is buried in classified files and sealed reports, but together we're bringing it to light. Remember, nature doesn't always play by the rules we think it does. And in Yellowstone, the Earth is always watching, always breathing, always waiting for someone who will listen to its call. The thermal features that draw millions of visitors every year with their beauty and their power, they're not just geological wonders, they're doorways. And sometimes those doorways open. This has been Void Case Files. Stay curious, stay cautious, and maybe, just maybe, stay away from the hot springs.